Hi everyone, I'm Matt Williams. I am a tutor in politics at the University of Oxford Jesus College. I'm also what's known as the Access Fellow because I try to make the university and its colleges more accessible to people that have historically been underrepresented. Today is the 9th of February 2021 at the time of recording, and President Donald Trump is going to go on trial for a second time on charges of impeachment in the Senate. And so I thought this was a good opportunity to talk about fake news and how to become a more critical reader. Now, what I'm not going to do, despite the temptation, is to create a big video along the lines of Donald Trump ought to be impeached, he's a crook, blah, blah, blah. That perhaps might lead to a lot of clicks and interest, but that's not particularly what I'm interested in. So I'm going to talk about a much earlier impeachment, the first impeachment, in fact, in US history, which is the impeachment of President Andrew Johnson. And I'm going to give you some tips about how to read more critically so that you're constantly thinking for yourself whilst you're doing research into a complex topic such as impeachment. Because what we often find when we are teaching our undergraduates at Oxford is that they tend to be quite passive recipients of other people's interpretations of the world. And what we want to inculcate in them is the capacity to think for themselves. And again, as with previous videos on the Think for Yourself series, there are various quite concrete skills that you can learn in order to master the art of being an independent thinker. And that's ultimately what a university degree at a university like Oxford tries to produce in you. And there's a particular reason for developing that skill of critical analysis, because it makes you particularly adept at dealing with doubt. Doubt is ubiquitous, absolutely everywhere. We are uncertain about the future, about ourselves, about all sorts of phenomena. And in order to try and take some sort of control over that, you need to be able to process what data you do have available in order to make some solutions to it. So, for example, if you want to become a lawyer, you need the capacity to determine how to resolve a case in your client's favor. If you want to grow a business, you need to determine how the market will adapt to your products. So that is management of doubt. And the first step is to be an independent critical thinker. If you are dependent and you're a passive thinker, then you are going to be recruited by somebody else. And fake news is a really interesting phenomenon to think about in this regard, because it is this charge that the newspapers are trying to recruit us for their own business model, that they are trying to sell their products, and to do so they are trying to a certain extent, hypnotize us. Now, I will be upfront and say that I have a lot of points upon which I disagree with the outgoing President Trump. But one thing that I actually do agree with him on is that the news is fake. I think his problem is that he didn't take that concept far enough. He aligned the notion of fake news with publications that opposed him personally. And actually, all news is fake. And inevitably so, because we don't really have access to the real world. So news is fake. But that's okay, that doesn't make it useless. It makes news an interpretation of reality rather than reality itself. But then we live our lives via interpretations of reality. So it's not useless. I'm not trying to say that fake news is somehow a bad thing. I'm not trying to say it's immoral. But we as individuals have to have the capacity to know when someone's trying to recruit us and know how to extract, nonetheless, the useful information from it. Now let's deal with some of the sort of philosophical undergirdings of this for a second, because I'm perhaps launching forward by basically saying, oh, everything's fake, and taking it as granted. And that's not necessarily a completely uncontroversial statement to make. Now, you can trace this back to the very origins of Western philosophy in the works of people like Socrates and Plato in particular. And Plato had a really evocative metaphor for this, which is that we all reside in a cave. And what we see in the cave is sunlight dancing on the walls and the shadows that are made from that sunlight. And that is the reality outside the cave. That's the real world. And what we see in the cave is just a sort of mediation of that real world. We don't actually see reality, we only see some sort of mediation of reality. And this has carried itself down through the tradition of Western philosophy into various forms of epistemic skepticism. In other words, the notion that we don't truly know the real world, and therefore everything that we consider to be real is in fact mediated either by society or by social constructs or neural constructs. Okay, a really fascinating contribution to this is from Immanuel Kant, who came up with this distinction between noumena, which is things in themselves, and phenomenon, which is things for us. So we don't really know things in themselves. We don't understand the truth of reality because it's simply too much for our brains to cope with. We're not evolved to be able to understand, for example, how quantum mechanics actually works. So we come up with some mechanisms for interpreting it that is sufficient for our purposes. And that's fine, but that's not reality. And so we are all in need of a big old-fashioned dollop of humility when it comes to making assertions about what is really going on, because no one knows what is really going on. Everything is an interpretation, everything, and therefore everything is fake news. But that's okay. As I said earlier, it doesn't make it useless. All that means is that we need to be sharpened in our wits so that we know when someone is trying to recruit us to their band, when they're trying to use us in order to sell a product or create political power or create momentum. We need to have the independent capacity to think for ourselves so that we can solve the problem, so that we can go and look at data and extract an interpretation of our own without being recruited. So I'm going to talk about the Andrew Johnson impeachment, and I'm going to compare two newspaper articles to show some of the devices that are often used and to show you some concrete skills as to how you can develop your independent critical thinking capacity. And once you start to practice this, it'll get quicker and quicker, and you'll start to notice the tricks very quickly. In fact, you might even start to become an expert in using the tricks yourself if you want to recruit people yourself, but I'm not necessarily advocating that. Anyway, let's talk very briefly about why Andrew Johnson was impeached. Andrew Johnson was Abraham Lincoln's vice president, so after that president was shot and killed at Ford's Theatre, Andrew Johnson took over. Andrew Johnson was a member of the Democrat Party. He was formerly a senator from the state of Tennessee, and so he became elevated to the presidency. He then oversaw what's known as Reconstruction, which is after the US Civil War. There was a Reconstruction period by which southern states that had formed the Confederacy and had left the Union were brought back into the fold. And there was a fierce debate amongst the Union states, so those states that had basically won the Civil War, as to how those southern states ought to be reincorporated. Those in the Republican Party, especially in the so-called radical wing of the Republican Party, were in favour of quite a stiff set of sanctions against those who had formerly been part of the Confederacy, including prosecutions for former members of the Confederacy, senior officers, and their exclusion from positions of power, and also the imposition of political power on southern states. The alternative perspective was to bring the southern states back in as equal members of the new union and to utilise some of the personnel of the Confederacy in the new union of states, and therefore adopt a more lenient policy. Now, Andrew Johnson was more in favour of the latter policy. He wanted a somewhat softer Reconstruction approach. And that put him at loggerheads with members of the cabinet, some of whom had been appointed by Abraham Lincoln, and in particular the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. And so Stanton and Johnson had very serious disagreements about how to reconstruct the Union after the war. Johnson tried to get rid of Stanton, but Congress tried to keep Stanton in because they saw Stanton as someone who was supporting their general perspective on how to reconstruct the Union. Johnson pushed Stanton out while Congress was in recess. Congress got terribly upset about this because they passed some specific legislation to try and stop Stanton being removed, and they drew up articles of impeachment. Now, whether or not it was a high crime and misdemeanor was a point of contention in the 1860s when Johnson was being impeached, just as it was in the early 2020s when Donald Trump was being impeached. But nonetheless, they came up with the articles of impeachment. They were passed by the House of Representatives, and then Johnson went to trial in the Senate. Ultimately, there were multiple articles of impeachment, and none of them were successful. And the Senate, by a single vote, failed to remove President Johnson. But looking at the newspapers of the time, we can see some of the techniques that are used by newspapers to this day in trying to recruit readers, in trying to diminish their critical capacity and to try and make them co-opted. Now, I happen to think that President Johnson was a disastrous president. I think the Reconstruction policy was appalling because it excused inexcusable crimes, and it has undermined race relations in America from that point to the present day. But I have to make sure that I don't allow myself not to think critically. So even when I'm reading newspaper articles that I'm broadly in agreement with, I have to make sure I maintain my independence of mind. Now, first of all, it's worth noting what are some of the techniques that newspapers and other sources of fact sharing use in order to try and recruit you. Well, there are, broadly speaking, three key ones to think about, although there are many more other devices you can have a look at if you're interested in this. Now, the first one is framing. Framing is whereby, metaphorically, we put a frame around a particular phenomenon, and whatever information goes inside the frame is highlighted, and what's left outside the frame is omitted. Now, any story that you try and put across on any subject will involve some form of framing. You will have to editorialize it in order to make it fit, because, again, reality is too complicated. Let's say, for example, you want to write a story about the situation in the Middle East. Well, where do you start? You could start at the very dawn of civilization, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia thousands of years ago, as mankind went from hunter-gathering to agriculture and town dwelling and all the rest of it. And you could, just end up with such an enormously complicated story that it would just be indigestible. So you have to sort of squish it all down to the key points that you want to get across. But then, of course, you will be guilty by commission and omission of editorializing the data. You will be picking and choosing the bits that people see because it's inside the frame, and what they don't see because you've left it out. So framing is a device that is inevitable. You can't really put across information without omitting something that might be relevant and important, and putting something forward that might be not relevant. So that's the first device, framing. What is it that the authors are trying to highlight our attention to? Okay. The next device is called priming. Priming is where, a bit like when you prime something to explode, something is ready to go off and you set it up long in the past. Now, one device that's sometimes used is to conjoin concepts that are perhaps more naturally disjunctive. So, for example, let's say a set of newspaper articles, not a single article, but a set of articles continues to make reference to an individual politician, and they also make some sort of assessment that that politician is incompetent. So politician incompetent, such that when you hear about that politician, you automatically can join the notion of incompetence to them, even if it's not been stated, because you've been primed to do so. And conversely, if you hear about something to do with incompetence, the concept of incompetence, you then gravitate that politician back to that concept as well. So those two are always conjoined, even if they're not necessarily naturally conjoined, because you've been primed to put the two pieces together. Okay. And the third classic device is use of literary approaches to writing. So writing style that is rich in terms of its use of language, its careful and cautious use of syntax, so the way sentences are put together, and use of devices like, say, metaphor and analogy to try and bring a piece to life. But of course, metaphor is even further removed from reality, because you're making some sort of reference to something that is literally not true, very, very far removed from the truth, but it brings something into a more emotional range. So, for example, putting all the pieces together, framing, priming, and use of metaphor, might be when the British government was talking about the migrant crisis in Europe and referred to some of the people coming into the UK as a swarm. So they were framing because they were focusing on a particular point of the migrant crisis relevant to the UK, even though the migrant crisis was a far bigger phenomenon than that. They were priming because they were trying to latch on to this notion that immigration is a bad thing. So they were trying to sort of put those two concepts together. And they were using metaphor by referring to people as a swarm. Now, swarm is a bestial metaphor. It's what we describe for, say, bees or bats when they come together in large groups, not human beings. So swarming is not something that human beings literally do. It's a metaphor, and it's something that dehumanizes those individuals and makes them less than people. So those sort of devices can be encapsulated very efficiently in only a handful of words to make people start to think, oh, well, we're being sort of overwhelmed by migrants and that's a bad thing, and that they're not really human beings, and so you think less of them. But this is just devices, in this case used by politicians, to try and recruit people. And again, if you think for yourself, you'll be able to notice what they're trying to do. You might, broadly speaking, agree that something needs to be done to control immigration, but you don't necessarily need to be fully co-opted by powerful people who want to use your emotional reaction for their benefit. Okay, now I'm going to read two paragraphs from newspapers at the time of Andrew Johnson's impeachment to highlight what I'm talking about. So first of all, from April 1868, so just before the Senate trial, coming from Harper's Weekly. Okay, the president's usurpations, the pretense that President Johnson is a martyr to his defense of the Constitution is intended only for the inexperienced. We maintain, on the contrary, that his present position before the country is due to his manifest and bold usurpation of power. Okay, so quite obviously, this author although I agree with the basic point that President Johnson was going beyond his power and was pursuing a disastrous policy in terms of Reconstruction, they are nonetheless laying on with a trowel these sorts of devices to try and co-opt me as a reader. And I need to, despite agreeing broadly speaking with the content of the article, need to make sure that I maintain my individuality. So the pretense that President Johnson is a martyr to his defense is really sort of rich use of language, lots of metaphor here. So he's obviously not literally a martyr. So that reference is trying to utilize a sort of strong literary language to make me more emotionally attached to it. Now, here's the kicker. The pretense is intended only for the inexperienced, only for people who are incapable of thinking for themselves. So it's insulting you if you don't agree with them because you're somehow inexperienced, because you've been taken in by this pretense. Okay, we maintain, on the contrary, that his present position before the country is due to his manifest and bold usurpation of power. Notice the use of noun qualifiers there, the adjectives manifest and bold. So they're really trying to enrich the language, but they're taking it even further from just a delivery of factual information. So even though, as I said earlier, all news is fake news, this is particularly far removed from reality because it's trying to double down on the subjectivity of the story. Now, I would advise that when you start critical reading practice, that you really start by just picking through the individual words that are used and go through it with a fine-tooth comb. And the more you do that, the more you'll lay the foundations such that you can do this very quickly. You'll start to notice, oh, hang on, that's the use of metaphor, that's not real. That's an interesting choice of language and vocabulary. That's an interesting choice of syntax and grammar. And you'll start to notice how the authors are trying to co-opt you, how they're trying to recruit you, and you can start to make up your own mind, therefore. Now, here's another article from the other perspective, from the New York Herald, and this comes from May 1868. So this is after the Senate had failed to remove President Johnson. Okay. The country will be relieved on learning that impeachment after a hard struggle died today. With some kicks and splurges and with one desperate effort to retain its lease of life, it yielded up the ghost to be buried. It is hoped, as soon as possible, by the managers, who are supposed to be the undertakers in this instance, and the chief mourners after old Ben Wade. Side note, Ben Wade was the president pro tempore of the Senate, so he was the most senior member of the Senate from the state of Ohio, and he would have become the president of the United States if Johnson had been removed from office. Well-informed people believed that that evening that a motion to postpone would be introduced and certainly carried, and the impression was confirmed this morning when the Radical Caucus, which had been in conference over an hour, decided upon voting for an adjournment to 4 weeks. Okay, so again, going through this in a fine-tooth comb, with a fine-tooth comb, you can start to see some of the ways in which the authors are trying to co-opt us. Okay, the country will be relieved. So the authors are arrogating to themselves the right to speak on behalf of the entire country. So they are pretending that their individual editorial is actually the mouthpiece of the entire nation, which is obviously ludicrous. Again, interesting comparison with the Harper's Weekly article that we just looked at. There's lots of use of death metaphors. So where Harper's Weekly referred to martyrdom, here we see a litany, a list of death metaphors. So with kicks and splurges, so that's referring to someone who's being hung who would kick and splurge. Kicks and splurges, and with one desperate effort to retain its lease of life, it yielded up the ghost to be buried. I mean, it's almost ludicrous how many references to death you get in a single sentence. And that sentence is spliced into multiple sub-sentences. With commas in order to sort of keep making this rat-a-tat motion, this sort of fast momentum of different death metaphors. It's a really sort of bizarre construction of language, but fascinating to look at, someone trying over and over again to talk about kicks, splurges, lease of life, ghosts, buried, right? Really sort of trying to get you, get your blood pumping, get your adrenaline going, get you angry. And also, in this sense, relieved because the impeachment process is over. Okay, so I really would encourage you to start looking very, very closely at the use of language. Language is a magnificently powerful tool that people use to try and recruit other human beings. Now, of course, I'm perhaps putting it a bit strongly myself. That's my own interpretation of someone trying to recruit me. And maybe my own interpretation is wrong. It almost certainly is wrong, given what I've been saying earlier about fake news. But the main point is that we want to respectfully listen to what other people have to say, because interpretations of reality is all we've got. It's the only way we have anything like a constructed universe to deal with. So we have to respectfully listen to them, but we must also be ready to contribute our own interpretations. And we must not be so eager to just go along with what someone else has to say. We have to think for ourselves. And I will spend 3 years with a student trying to train them in being very good and very efficient at reading critically, about reading some text, thinking about what's said, respecting what has been said, but nonetheless coming up with their own interpretations. And when I'm looking for students in the admissions process who I think will be a good fit at Oxford, I'm looking for people who have that nascent capacity, who have that raw ability to think for themselves. So I want you to go and look at some newspaper articles, and ideally a couple from very different perspectives on the same story, and see how they try and pull you this way and that. Don't let yourself be dragged around. Think for yourself and notice the tricks that are being employed to try and recruit you. I hope this has been helpful. As ever, leave me some comments and questions if you want me to answer anything. Get in touch if you have any follow-up questions. I'll be very happy to help. And take care of yourselves in this difficult time. All best wishes. Thanks. Bye.